You're listening to Overdoing It, the Rhode Island Library podcast. Hi, and welcome to another episode of Overdoing It, where our team of library workers dish about their latest reads, views, and passions alongside fascinating conversations with local luminaries. I'm your host, Tayla, and the branch librarian at the Oaklawn Branch Library in Cranston, and my pronouns are she, her. Let's dive in and discover who our guest is today.
My name is Phil Isle. I am a freelance journalist based in my hometown of Providence, Rhode Island, and the author of a new-ish book, Prescription for Pain, How a Once Promising Doctor Became the Pill Mill Killer, and my pronouns are he, him.
Thank you for joining us. A little bit later in the show, we'll talk about your book and the story behind it, but before we get into that, let's start off as we always do with what have you been reading?
So I will try to keep it brief. I'm a bit of a juggler with what I'm reading. I'm currently reading in print 2 books. James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. I'm on a bit of a Baldwin kick, and I'm looking forward to reading more of him as 2025 goes on. And I am also reading for a work project a book called Let Me Take You Down, Inside the Mind of Mark David Chapman, the man who killed John Lennon. My next book project, which is a nonfiction project, involves John Lennon's FBI file, and I'm trying to learn a bit more about the assassination, tee that up. And I'm listening to, because these days, ever since I was on my book tour and doing a lot of driving and listening to a lot of books, I've always got a audiobook in the queue, and I'm listening to Tim Miller's Why We Did It, a travelogue from the Republican Road to Hell, former Republican consultant who kind of tries to explain how the Trump phenomenon happened.
All right. So like all kind of heavy stuff. No light escapism right now.
I mean, I'm a true crime guy.
Yeah.
I wrote this true crime book, and sometimes when I'm at like a book event, people will come up and take a look at the book and be like, oh, wow, dark. And I'm like, oh, right. Yeah, it is really dark because I don't even notice.
You like become removed from it after a while, that it's just like the project you're working on.
Yeah, and as I guess my 3 reading selections illustrate, I guess I'm kind of dwelling on the darker side of the street just all the time, and I don't even notice at this point.
I know, but you're not the only one. The popularity of true crime books and podcasts are showing that people are fascinated with why people do crime.
Totally. And if you had asked me, and maybe we can get into this later on, what I'm watching on TikTok, it's like cat videos, because I have 2 cats who I'm always posting about. So it's not all darkness. I am a voracious consumer of cat content. Well, so that helps me even it out.
All right. So your escapism is happening in other avenues.
Exactly.
It's been escapism for me, even though it is really grounded in fact, which is what I enjoyed about it. But my nonfiction book that I have going right now is called Under Alien Skies. The author will be in the show notes. I totally forgot. And it is a astronomer. He kind of was like bringing his love of his work and his love of science fiction, which kind of led him to his work, into this book all about what it would be like if/when we go there.
That sounds really cool.
Yeah. So it started out with the moon and if there were any kind of colonization or even like tourism on the moon, what that would be like. Then moved on to Mars.
Mm-hmm.
It skipped over Jupiter, unless we're going to circle back again, only halfway through, which I was a little disappointed about because as a kid, and I don't know why, Jupiter was my favorite planet. Like I picked it somewhat arbitrarily, but I was a little disappointed. But Saturn has the ring, so I get it. He talked a lot about the rings, and it's actually really cool.
I'm not that much of a science guy, but from what I remember, because Jupiter's so big, you'd get smushed immediately.
Well, the same thing would happen with Saturn too, but he talked about actually that like traveling to Saturn, basically you would like go on a shuttle and see all the rings on like a spaceship, and then you would transfer to this gondola with balloons so that you could like float through the upper atmosphere / like top layers of Saturn in order to go on world.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, once you get to the parts in Saturn that are solid, he's like, you'd be gone 15 different ways before you even got there because it's so hot and there's so much pressure.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought that was interesting that he takes the facts, but then is also imagining like this future where there's tourism to Saturn, like where you go on this gondola that's like a lounge inside with like windows for viewing the rings on one side.
So, Tayla, if you were offered the opportunity to go on some of this space tourism, would you do it?
If we got space travel to Star Trek level, where it's like not a big deal. You know what I mean? Like you could just
Yeah.
be walking around. It's like you're in an office or a
Mm-hmm.
home. If space travel got to that, then I would be like, yeah, let's go. But I just don't think I have a hardy enough constitution to go into space if it was like, shooting a rocket from the planet in order to leave our atmosphere.
Right.
I don't know if the body or the spirit is strong enough.
Or I think there's an astronaut in the space station currently where like the shuttle that was supposed to take them home is like months late. So like
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they're stuck on the
yeah.
ISS for like a year or something.
Yeah, so we're not quite at Star Trek levels.
No, we're definitely not. So, very unlikely in my lifetime, but also kind of like related to that reading and probably what led me to it is I've also, with my partner, been listening to the audiobooks of The Expanse, which is James S.A. Corey 9-book sci-fi series. But one of the
Mm,
things that I really appreciate about it is very like hard sci-fi in that they like try to adhere to the science when we know the science. Like
mm-hmm,
they are imagining technology beyond what we have the capability of, but they also are very real about like how hard it is to travel through space.
mm,
Like basically in that world we can go pretty fast but still not like the speed of light or anything. And then everyone on the ship when we're going like over 1G just gets pumped full of amphetamines and other drugs to stay conscious and like not have a stroke. So I appreciate that there are like, even though we're in space, there's multiple generations of people who've
yeah.
lived their whole lives in space. Like living in space is not easy. And I appreciate that about it because I feel like I don't know, it just feels more true. It feels like what probably will happen in the future.
So what book number are you on?
We just finished 7.
Nice.
So yeah, 2 books and 1 short story left. So yeah, we're getting there. We're getting there. So besides books, have you been watching anything interesting lately?
Yes. So here's where things get a little bit lighter. At
Okay.
least when it comes to the stuff I watch with my partner, Georgina. Together, we just finished the new season of The Great British Baking Show, which is like classic escapism. Um, so watched a lot of episodes of that. We're also watching English Teacher, the sitcom on FX, which is really excellent. It's like newish, probably within the last year, about a public school, high school teacher in Austin, Texas. And we're also watching Abbott Elementary, another good school-based sitcom. When it comes to my own stuff, there it gets dark again. I'm watching the HBO docuseries Last Call, when a serial killer stalked queer New York. It was kind of an open question of whether I would continue to read and watch true crime after my own book came out, whether I would have like exhausted the appetite for that, but it turns out so. So yeah. How about you?
um Part of why we've been making such great progress through these audiobooks is when my partner and I have free time in the evenings, we listen to this audiobook versus like watching television,
Hmm.
which I think has been really good.
Yeah,
And I started crocheting during it, so that's
love
nice
that.
to get back to that hobby and have something to do with my hands. Because otherwise, I fall asleep, and then he's all like, "How could you fall asleep during the most exciting part?" And I was like, "I didn't know it was going to get exciting," because he's read all these books already, so
Hmm.
it's like introducing it to me and stuff. So yeah, when we're not listening to the audiobook, we also are playing Baldur's Gate 3 together, which we are close to the end of. So that's been fun and is interesting to see the ways that the game designers both succeeded and maybe didn't succeed in translating a tabletop game like Dungeons and Dragons to a video game.
Hmm. I also should mention, because I always want to give them a shout out, I'm not necessarily a regular podcast listener, except for there's one podcast I really listen to regularly called Vibe Check, which is a weekly kind of news discussion podcast with Saeed Jones, Sam Sanders, and Zach Stafford. I'm a huge fan of that. And so I want to put in a shout out for them because I really like listening to that once a week.
Is it like bringing kind of some levity to current events type podcast?
There's definitely some levity. They do joke around a bit, although they kind of just process it. I mean, the concept of the show is that it's kind of like the group chat between these three friends in podcast form. So there are
Nice.
laughs. There's also righteous anger, and they're each really smart and kind of have been in the news world or in the writing world. So they bring a lot of good insight too. So I like that combination.
Fantastic. So I want us to have enough time to talk about your book. So could you tell everyone a little bit about what Prescription for Pain is about?
Sure. So you may have guessed from what I've said so far in the show that it is a true crime story. Prescription for Pain tells the story of a med school classmate of my dad, actually a college and medical school classmate of my dad, named Paul Volkman, who is currently serving 4 consecutive life terms in prison for prescription drug dealing. There have been dozens, if not hundreds, of doctors charged with prescription drug dealing crimes over the course of the opiate epidemic across the country. Just about every state has had at least one case like this. We've certainly had a couple in Rhode Island. And this guy, Paul Volkman, who was practicing out of cash-only pain clinics in Southern Ohio in the mid and early 2000s, wound up getting the biggest sentence out of any of them. So if I hadn't had this personal connection to the story, I probably wouldn't have ever known about it, wouldn't have gotten interested. But all the way back when I was 23, 24 years old, I'm now 39, I learned about this long lost classmate of my dad's who had gotten himself into some really serious trouble. At that point, he was facing a federal indictment. He was subsequently convicted. And one of the books that had made me want to be a writer in the first place was Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. And I just thought, this is an incredible story. And to me, at that point, a mystery of what had happened to this guy who had once been a high school valedictorian. He had an MD, PhD from the University of Chicago. He was a really, on paper, kind of an unlikely criminal. And so I spent more than a decade researching it, interviewing people, traveling out to Ohio. And last April, the book, my publishing debut, finally came out. And I have been going around anywhere I can, bookstores, libraries, podcasts, book clubs, community centers, to talk to people about this story I spent so long working on privately. And I've been to a few libraries in Rhode Island too. That's been one of the real delights of the book release process has been going to libraries in Rhode Island too.
Fantastic. So not to give too much away, like we want to encourage people to go and check out the book, but from my understanding, you find out about this guy and it's like, wow, how did that happen? It seemed like he was, like you said, on paper, a real kind of like normal, if not exemplary in terms of like his academic achievements guy. Like, how do you end up becoming part of this whole thing? And as you dig into the story, that you see that kind of like two narratives emerge of like his narrative of the events and then what came out in the court proceedings and the kind of evidence when you talk to other folks about him and the situation.
Definitely. I didn't know going in when I got interested that I was going to have such remarkable access. There's kind of a robust genre within true crime of stories that involve the alleged perpetrators themselves who have participated. The Jinx, the HBO docuseries features Bob Durst a lot. The first season of Serial, which in a lot of ways kicked off the current true crime craze, allows you to listen to the alleged criminal himself. And this wound up being that kind of story where I reached out to this guy who was awaiting his trial, explained who I was, asked if I could speak to him, and he agreed to speak with me for many, many hours in person before he was convicted. And then he continued to speak to me via letters and later emails after his conviction. So, as kind of a basis for the story, I have a lot of his words about what happened in his life and in his career. And in short, he maintains he did nothing wrong. He maintains he did nothing wrong in the malpractice lawsuits that preceded his alleged criminal activity, which resulted in jury verdicts against him and insurance settlements against him and wound up rendering him uninsurable, which is why he went into these kind of sketchy pain clinics. And he maintains that when he was down there in Southern Ohio for about 3 years working in these pain clinics, in what prosecutors said was a drug dealing operation, he says it was totally above board. He was according to him, law-abiding, conscientious, professional doctor who was treating the ailments of his patients. But I'm a journalist, and for this story and for any story that's kind of adversarial, I wasn't interested in simply writing down what he said and not checking that. And so I often describe the book as kind of one long exercise in fact checking this guy, Paul Volkman, who it turns out is not a particularly reliable narrator. A lot of what he says distorts the truth, leaves out key things, is flat out untrue. And so over the course of the book, as you say, I am going around talking to people, checking documents, and offering my readers a more journalistically rigorous version of what actually happened. So what emerges is these two stories, his version and, for lack of a better term, the facts as I could find them.
Do you think Prescription for Pain would have come out even if he wasn't as forthcoming with the information? Or was that kind of the thing that really cinched the narrative for you?
That's a great question. I don't know. I do know that if I did pursue it without his cooperation, it would have been a shorter book. It would have been less detailed. There would have been less texture to it. I still would have had, there's really two huge sources of information that are a direct result of Paul Volkman's stubbornness, arguably his arrogance, and his belief in his innocence. There's the fact that he talked to me for years and years and years, first in person and then via letters. And I build off a lot of that in the book. And then there's the fact that, unlike the vast majority of criminal defendants, he didn't accept a plea deal, and his case went to a lengthy federal trial in Cincinnati in 2011, where 80 witnesses testified, 70 of them for the government. And the transcript for that wound up being over 4,000 pages long. And a lot of people described in detail, under oath, what happened inside these clinics. So even if he hadn't spoken to me, I would have drawn on that trial transcript and those documents like I do. But without that, without the two of those things, it would have been a much shorter book and much more difficult to write and probably a lot less satisfying just from a sense of understanding what happened. But pretty early on, one of the very first people I interviewed was him. So from 2009, I knew that he was participating and I was off to the races. And that's partly why I stuck with the project, was because I knew that I had this guy's voice in there, even if it turned out to be pretty misleading and factually inaccurate. I still had him.
Do you think part of his willingness to talk to you was the connection through your dad, or did you not even lead with that?
I've been asked that before. It's a completely understandable question, but I don't think it made much of a difference. I think he's the kind of guy who would have welcomed anyone showing up at his doorstep and saying, hey, I would like to listen to your version of the story without judgment for potential publication down the road. Because he told me flat out he was eager for publicity. I think he thought he could manipulate me into believing his side of the story. And perhaps, a fraction of why he said yes to me was the fact that I mentioned in my query letter that I was his old classmate's son. But I think he would have talked to just about anybody. That's just how he is.
Yeah. I'm struggling to think of a good example, but I'm sure there are a multitude of them. But yeah, people who are very willing to be like, well, I'm going to go on this news network, and in many cases, a news network who they think is going to be sympathetic to their case because they are also spinning this narrative of people like them being victimized and tell everyone the real story so that everyone has it straight.
Mm-hmm. And I will say that even though Paul Volkman, doesn't have a lot of people who believe his version of the story, because of the nature of his crimes, that he claimed to be a pain doctor who was treating vulnerable people, there is a very thin sliver of I hesitate to even call it the world of public health, but the world of public opinion, of folks who claim to be acting in the interest of pain patients, who there's kind of a radical corner of this world that believes basically any doctor charged with prescription drug dealing related to opiates is in fact innocent. And there's a website where they track these cases, and it's not a particularly rigorous website, but Volkman found an audience there. He found a place that would write sympathetically about him and publish pieces he written from prison. So if people don't want to take my word for what this guy is like, they can go to that website and read him in his own words, writing in 2018, an open letter from prison. But for the most part, this case, I think for a variety of reasons, mainly because there were so many doctor cases like this, hadn't necessarily gotten a lot of attention by the time that I showed up on the scene.
But it is a very nuanced conversation. And I don't want to say this in a way that makes it sound like I believe that this guy is innocent, because it's not the case. But from what I've heard from folks dealing with chronic pain and chronic illness, the crackdown on opioids has made it harder for them to get medications that they need when those medications are really like the last stop option for them. You know, like insurance companies are like, well, try this like non opioid related pain medication. It's like, well, I tried that X amount of years ago. Like what, like I've done all the stuff, and now all of these new rules are making it harder for me to get the care that I need.
And that was one of the things I found so interesting, and probably one of the things that kept me motivated on this story was, one, Paul Volkman is a very qualified, intelligent guy who's far more trained than I am in this stuff. And it took me a long time to be able to stand on my calling BS on some of his claims, because who am I? I don't have an MD. I don't have a PhD. And beyond that, the cause that he was claiming to stand for is one that I respect. I certainly don't want people who are in chronic pain to suffer any more than they have to. I'm very sympathetic to the plight of people in that situation. And I go out of my way in my book talks to say, this is not even an anti-opiate book necessarily. It's a book about a guy who had a particularly dangerous pattern of behavior in prescribing opiates and other drugs. But those drugs I spoke to many experts in the field of pain management. They're among the most powerful tools we have for addressing certain kinds of pain. They have potential side effects and dangers associated with them, as all drugs do. The side effects and potential dangers are particularly pronounced with opiates. But there's a lot of gray area. And when it comes to the crimes he was charged with, the trial in this book is about one side saying this guy was a doctor, the other side saying this was a drug dealer. And it wasn't like there's a certain number of pills over which you become a drug dealer. It's a subjective thing where it was based on, words like legitimate. And we had experts arguing either side in his trial, experts who said on his behalf he was actually a legitimate doctor, and on the government side saying this is a drug dealer. So there was a lot of nuance involved in this, and there still is a lot of nuance, and people can bring different things to this story. So that was it was really rich and complicated subject matter. That's what made the story hard. That's one of the reasons why I worked on it for so long, but it's also one of the reasons why I really wanted to see the project through, because I felt it was important.
So is that, I don't want to make it seem like I'm leading the witness now that we've been talking about court cases, but
no, this isn't a courtroom. This is just a podcast. You can lead me.
Would you say that this kind of nuance that you brought to the conversation is what you were hoping to bring to this larger conversation about opioids and the opioid crisis? Or were you not even thinking about being part of that conversation when you were writing the book and you were thinking of it more as like an up and
Hmm.
down true crime story?
Great question. Well, I mean, when I'm talking about what I thought during the project, I have to note that from the moment I learned about this guy to the moment the book was published was literally a period of 15 years,
Yeah.
from 2009 to 2024. So I wasn't just thinking one thing. I evolved over that time. I grew up as a person, as a journalist. This isn't a televised podcast, but I had a lot more hair when I started. And I'd say at first, I just was interested in what struck me as a remarkable personal story of a guy who had fallen from great heights, who had a really remarkable education, an MD and a PhD, who lived in a fancy apartment on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago when he was arrested, almost like, living on Bellevue Ave in Newport for Rhode Islanders. And over time, as I dug into the story, I realized the layers that were there. And the fact that this was a story about a particular era of the opiate epidemic and about a particular place that had been hard hit by opiates in Southern Ohio. But also, by the time the book came out in 2024, this is hardly the first nonfiction book about the opiate epidemic. The book arrived after many, many excellent nonfiction books about the opiate epidemic, whether it's Barry Meyer's book Painkiller, which was one of the first, or Beth Macy's Dope Sick, or Patrick Radden Keefe's Empire of Pain, or Sam Quinones's Dreamland. There are so many great books. There's other books about the fentanyl crisis. So by the time I was working on the book, from like 2021 to on like the home stretch through publication, I could relax a little bit with the bigger picture because I knew that there were these other books out there already. And I see my book as joining a conversation. It's not the be all end all of opiate epidemic books. It's one book on a shelf about this massive man-made crisis that we're still dealing with and dealing with here in Rhode Island. One of the things that was kind of sad and tragic to watch was when I first started on this in 2009, it felt like when I went to Ohio, I was going to a place where the outbreak was the worst. It was probably happening in Rhode Island, but not nearly as bad as it was out there. But by the time the early 2010s rolled around, Rhode Island, like every corner of this country, became affected really badly, with heroin overdoses and fentanyl overdoses, which are still ongoing. So the story kind of followed me home in a sense.
Is Dope Sick the one that got the Hulu show?
Yes.
Complete non sequitur. I just was trying to remember.
No, it is related because there are two really excellent scripted series. Painkiller on Netflix is the one with Matthew Broderick as one of the Purdue Pharma people, and Taylor Kitsch plays a car mechanic struggling with addiction. And on Hulu, Dope Sick has Michael Keaton playing a doctor who struggles with addiction. And it's remarkable the reach that those shows have because I would tell people, what I was working on. They would say, oh, Dope Sick or, oh, Painkiller. And so before I headed out on my book tour, I watched those so I could have a conversation with people about the shows, which I think are both pretty good.
I haven't watched either of them. I was just aware of them, but I know when Dope Sick was coming out, that was, I think, the first time that I had really, which is maybe me just being very separate from the issue in the privileged place that I am in my life, but was the first time I had really heard this narrative of like, oh, when they first developed these drugs, they were like, no, they're not addictive at all. Like it's this amazing drug we just developed. We're going to crack pain management wide open, which I mean, they did, but not in the way they intended.
Right.
That was, I think, the first time that I was even aware that was like the genesis of these drugs and the pervasiveness of them was that they thought that they created something that wasn't highly addictive.
That's interesting to hear you say that because I've been researching this for so long. I've kind of lost track of the level of awareness that folks who aren't studying this have. So it's interesting to hear that was the first. I mean, that makes total sense. But it also shows the kind of ways that the more stories get out, the way that the knowledge of how this all happened eventually kind of permeates the culture. And to have a Hulu series and a Netflix series is a really powerful way to do that.
But yeah, I don't know if you can use me as a case study, because I think maybe generally was just kind of sheltered about these things, because I also remember when I first started working here, I would say probably within the first year or two, we had a training about administering Narcan.
Yeah.
We have Narcan at the libraries. It was optional to take this training, but I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to take this training and have Narcan at my library, because if I ever have the opportunity to stop someone from dying in my library, I'm going to do that. That's like a no-brainer to me.
And let me just interject. That's wonderful that you have that attitude and that the library has that attitude. You would be surprised. I am surprised that in some places, I'd say less so, but it's still there. Narcan can be controversial.
Yeah.
Because some people think, and I'm not endorsing this at all, there's such a still pervasive stigma around substance use disorder
Mm-hmm.
where people associate it as a moral failure. They value the lives of people struggling with this less. And they think, why would we save that person? Why
Yep.
bother?
Mm-hmm. That this is their punishment for their life choices.
Exactly. And that they, to some extent, deserve whatever happens to them. And again, not endorsing this, but this is an
No.
attitude that I've heard. And so I just want to publicly thank you for that attitude because it's the right one, I think. And it is good that public places like libraries have Narcan and people trained to use it because I'm sure without getting into the details, just like every public place in the opiate epidemic, I'm sure there have been overdoses, if not in Rhode Island libraries, then libraries across the country, because there are people there, and people have been overdosing everywhere in this epidemic era. So I'm glad you took the training and are ready for what happens.
But so at this training, the woman who was conducting this training had basically like kind of laid it out for me in a way I had never heard before drug addiction being framed. And like she basically said to us that she was like, no one wakes up in the morning and says, I would like to try heroin today. She was like, many of these people get prescribed opioids for some type of pain management problem, injury, what have you. Their prescription runs out, and it's cheaper to get heroin on the street than to get perk 30s on the street.
Yep.
So that's where people end up.
For listeners who can't see me, I'm nodding vigorously as Tayla is talking because I've heard that way of describing it, and it's great. That is the way we ought to think about this. Just as people don't sign up and say, I want to have heart disease, or I want to have diabetes, or I am, a weak person because I have heart disease or skin cancer. I see this in the same vein. It's a health issue. These drugs are very, very powerful, and they were just spread and prescribed and really inundated the country for a period of time. And it's really no wonder that a lot of people got hooked on them. And this, I had an opportunity to tell one story within that broader crisis, a story that I had a personal connection to, and I just kept digging and digging, and there was a lot to talk about in that one story, and a lot of what I found I think applies more broadly too.
But I just know that was the first time that it was, yeah, that it was kind of ever posed to me as not a personal failing, and that there is like clear cause and effect that leads people to get in these situations that I think demands empathy.
Mm-hmm. This was something that I was really interested in and concerned about in writing a book that involved opiates, drug addiction, and people who died. How was I going to talk about these people? How was I going to write about these people? And some of that stigma came out in Volkman's trial, where experts who were testifying in his defense went out of their way in their efforts to exonerate him and to blame people who had gone to him who may have been not so honest about their symptoms because they were struggling with addiction. And I talk about that in the book, and I really wanted my readers to come away with a sense that these were people who had loving families, who had hobbies, who had professions, who had futures worth living for. And they were not, moral failures. They were victims of a crime, and that crime involved opiates. So I really wanted to humanize them because folks struggling with this illness are so often dehumanized in our culture and in the ways we talk about.
I think that is a poignant way to leave it off.
Yeah,
So,
sure.
we end the show with a segment we call the last chapter, where we talk about a library of bookish related questions. So, I thought I would ask you today, would you rather have the ability to speak and understand any language in the world, but only when you were reading, or to be able to instantly transport yourself to a setting of a book that you're reading?
Ooh. When you ask a language question like that, that involves another language. I think I'm going to choose that one because my girlfriend is originally from Lebanon, and so she speaks Arabic. She speaks English, but she also speaks Arabic. And it would be really lovely. I've picked up a few words over the years we've been dating, some of them nicer than others. And it would be really, even within the limitations of your hypothetical of just reading, it'd be really fun to be able to read stuff in her native. So I'm going to choose that one, even though it would be nice to transport myself. But as I said, as you may have hinted from the top, I'm reading a lot of dark stuff. So maybe being transported to these darker places is less appealing anyway. So I'm going to go with option A.
We've asked a similar question about like going to book settings before,
Mm-hmm.
which myself and guests have had a lot of interesting opinions about. But I think I'm also going to have to go with the language, just because I feel like so much gets lost in translation. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's an idiom for a reason, because it really is true. So to be able to read books in their original language and have all that original context and nuance, I think would be really great, versus having to get it secondhand and stuff. Even though I do find like localizations very interesting. Like in college, I had a little bit of an anime phase, and it was interesting to find out for the dubs where they put the English words over the animation,
Mm-hmm.
like certain things that they had to like full on kind of change what the lines were,
Mm-hmm.
because they were just
Yeah.
like, American audiences will not understand this
Yeah.
joke.
Yeah.
They will
Yeah.
not understand this because it is so deeply rooted in Japanese culture, and you need to have like the understanding of maybe not a native, but someone who's lived there for a long time in order to understand all of that
I'm
nuance.
smiling because the version of this is when I like semi-jokingly ask people to explain world events to me in Rhode Island terms. Like, so this is Seekonk and this is Pawtucket and like,
Yeah,
and also say I don't want to, with in a world without the magical ability to understand other languages. I want to give a shout out to translators. My friend Julia Sanchez is a translator living here in Rhode Island from Portuguese to English. And I know the work she does is very hard. And I went to an interview she did with a book event with another translator, and I was just amazed. I had like a one dimensional kind of kindergarten version understanding of what translating involved. And it involved so much, like you say, location stuff, but also like idioms are really hard.
yeah.
And like things
Hmm.
that rhyme, and like how do you get a rhyme from the original uh, language to the language you're translating into. It's a remarkable job that translators do. So shout out to
For
all
sure.
translators and to my friend Julia.
I think also why I'm skipping the instantly transporting to settings of books is because a lot of fantasy settings I don't know if I want to be in. Like Star Wars, this huge cultural
Yeah.
phenomenon. Everyone's like, oh, I'd love to live in the world of Star Wars. You'd love to be in the Star Wars? Like, what is the likelihood that you're just like a guy in Star Wars? You know what I mean? Completely unaffected by the Empire. You're just a guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, that seems very unlikely.
Yeah. It shows you how little fiction. I mean, I read some fiction, but I can't even think of what the locales of the books that actually be a nice one.
Hobbiton. That's my go-to.
Yeah.
I love the J.R.R. Tolkien quote that I am a hobbit in everything but size, because as someone who is 5'8", but would love to just be like a little person in a little hobbit hole, I feel that.
I'll have to
But
think
that's
about.
one of the few ones that it's like,
Yeah.
it's nice. And it's nice only if you stay there. You
Mm-hmm.
know what I mean? Only
Mm-hmm.
if you are the quintessential hobbit and you don't go on adventures and you stay in Hobbiton and you live in your little hole and live a simple, quaint life. That's
Mm-hmm.
the only time it's good. You go out there and then there's ring wraiths and all kinds of bad stuff.
Eyes of Sauron, is that?
Yeah.
I'm reaching into my limited fantasies.
I know. I've really challenged you today. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
you have. I
As a
appreciate
big
it.
sci-fi fantasy
I
person.
appreciate it. My strengths are in like Rhode Island politics, news, history, and true crime. Sci-fi is outside of my purview. But we'd make a good trivia team.
Yeah, I definitely need people who've got like the more, not that I don't know any history, but
Yeah.
sometimes I'm like, I don't know. I vaguely remember this from history class, but I don't have any specifics in order to answer this question correctly.
Yeah.
So, well, before we depart, where can people find your book and more info about you on the World Wide Web?
Well, perhaps the first thing I would say is they can find my book at many of Rhode Island's public libraries. I'm just looking at the website now, and I am delighted. I mean, it's checked out in a few places, but it is in the system in Cranston and Fox Point and Mount Pleasant, Newport, North Kingston, Pasco. I haven't seen that one. Tuckett, Westerly. So, wow, I didn't need another reason to love libraries, but the fact that there are so many of my copies of my book in Rhode Island libraries, it just makes me so happy. So you can ask your local library about my book, Prescription for Pain, How a Once Promising Doctor Became a Pill Mill Killer. You can also buy it if you want. It's carried by a lot of our lovely independent bookshops in Rhode Island, which I've been fortunate to visit and have events at some of them. I've met at least 2 of the in-store cats in the state at Heartleaf Books, Penny, and at Stillwater Books, Freddie. And if all else fails, the book is available from the big online retailers as well. People can find me on virtually all of the social networks, although I am spending less time on Twitter these days and more time on Blue Sky. I'm among those who are kind of making the migration, but I'm on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, and Blue Sky. And I don't have any Rhode Island events on the books currently, but I have a paperback coming out in April, and I'm always reaching out to bookstores and libraries, so they can stay tuned to my social media, and I hope to have more library and bookstore events coming up. I put out a call when my book came out, which I'm happy to repeat here, that literally any library that wants to host me for a book talk in Rhode Island, I will do it. I think I've been to 3 or 4 of them so far, so that leaves a lot of them. So if you're listening, fellow librarians, I will come to your library and talk about my book. So DM me. Yes, so that's where all the places where people can find me.
Fantastic. So thank you for joining me, and thank you everyone for listening. If you would like to respond to the last chapter question or just reach out to the show, you can send us an email at overdoingitpod@gmail.com, spelled overdue like all the library books at my house. Or you can find us on Instagram at overdoingitpod. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a friend and rate and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps us reach more Rhode Islanders. Overdoing It is proud to be a resident partner of the Rhode Island Center for the Book and is brought to you by library staff and community members all around the Ocean State. The project has been funded in part by the Rhode Island Office of Library and Information Services. Thank you again for listening, and this has been another episode of Overdoing It, the Rhode Island Library Podcast. We're overdoing it, but you're doing just fine. Try this not thing. Very eloquent.